You weren't meant to survive this. The sky has shifted. The land is melting. Everything you've ever known, the mammoths, the bone shelters, the rhythms of the frozen earth, is vanishing. And the world isn't getting better, it's getting stranger, wetter, warmer, hungrier. You're standing on the ragged edge of the ice age, not at its beginning but its end. And no one prepared you for what comes next. You're not farming. Not yet. You don't even have the word. But you're watching the herds vanish and the old hunting trails flood. You're holding seeds in your hands without understanding what they are, or that they might be your last hope. You don't know it, but the question now isn't just how to survive. It's what to grow. And the choices you make in the mud and chaos of this thawing world will shape everything that comes after. You feel it in your bones before you ever see it, the silence. It's not the kind of quiet that settles after snowfall or descends at night. This is deeper, heavier. It hums beneath your skin, hollow and unspoken, the absence of something that was always there. No herds in the distance. No bird calls, no low thunder of migrating giants beneath your feet. The world hasn't gone still. It's gone strange. The cold is familiar, but it no longer behaves. Winters linger in pockets where they used to stretch endlessly. Ice clings only to the shaded crevices. The rest melts, slowly, methodically, like the earth itself is exhaling. But you don't feel warmth. You feel exposed, naked in a world that no longer obeys its own rules. You've lived your entire life, and your ancestors for hundreds of generations before you, by reading the language of ice and wind and bone. You know how snow speaks before it falls. You know how to listen for the silence of predators. You know where to place your traps by following the deep-carved trails of mammoths and reindeer and aurochs. But now those trails are softening. They wash away in rain that shouldn't exist, in floods that rise where hard frost once ruled. The prey doesn't come as it once did. Some have vanished entirely, others scatter unpredictably, avoiding the ancient roots you still cling to. And in their absence, something else begins to settle over the land: uncertainty. You were taught that change comes slowly, that glaciers crawl like sleeping gods shaping valleys over lifetimes. But now it's happening fast, too fast. The old maps in your mind no longer hold. The stars still shine, but even they feel farther away. The sun lingers longer, the ground thaws earlier, and you wonder, not aloud, not yet, if the earth is breaking its own rhythm. The elders don't have words for this. Not really. They speak of spirits stirring, of the sky becoming thin, of fire beneath the ice. But you can see the fear in their eyes, the recognition that the age they mastered is slipping through their fingers. No one says it, but everyone knows. Something is ending, and whatever comes next won't be guided by memory. You begin to notice small things, patches of green sprouting where they never did before, strange plants creeping into old hunting grounds, a fungus you've never seen blooming from wet logs, insects multiplying too early in the season, birds staying longer than they should. The rules of the old world aren't breaking, they're mutating. And so are you. You wake earlier, you walk farther, you spend more time near rivers, not just to fish but to watch, to listen. Something stirs in you, a kind of hunger, not for meat or warmth or fire, but for something you can't name yet: stability. A place where the land doesn't shift beneath your feet, where the seasons stay put, where you're not always chasing. But the idea of staying still is dangerous, maybe even insane. Your ancestors survived because they moved, always moved with the herds, with the seasons, with the cold. They carved their resilience from motion. And yet now motion feels like running from shadows. The animals are fewer. The forests are deeper. The rivers wider. How much longer can you chase ghosts? There's a memory in your hands, ancient, unbroken, of how to shape a spear, how to strip sinew, how to listen to stone. That memory kept you alive in the coldest years. But now, as warmth returns in strange rhythms, you begin to wonder if that memory is enough. And then one day it happens. You find no tracks, no scat, no broken branches, nothing. You climb the same ridge you always have, overlooking the steppe that once teemed with life. And it's empty, not quiet, empty, a silence that echoes. You sit not because you're tired, but because you don't know what else to do. The spear in your hand feels suddenly useless. The cold in the wind feels unfamiliar, not threatening, not friendly, just indifferent. This is the last winter, not the coldest, not the most violent, but the one where the old world finally unravels. And you're not ready. You still know how to survive the snow, but can you survive the melt? You still know how to read the sky, but can you read the soil? The old wisdom is still inside you, but it's losing its voice. And yet you remain, you breathe, you adapt. You start watching not just the animals, but the plants. You notice which roots grow in newly thawed patches. You observe which berries come early, which stalks bend toward warmth. You don't understand why yet. You're not farming, you're not cultivating, but you're noticing. And that noticing will become everything. Because this isn't just the end of an age, it's the birth of something else, something slower, stranger, more permanent. You don't have a word for it yet, but in the distant future they will call it the Anthropocene. You will not name it, but you will feel it. The moment when the earth stopped being just a background for your survival and began reacting to your presence, responding to your choices, shaping itself around your hunger, your fire, your movement, and eventually your growth. The last winter didn't kill you, it challenged you. And in that challenge, it planted something deeper than a seed, a question. What will you become when the hunt ends? And what must you grow to begin again? That question will follow you into the thaw. You wake to a sky that doesn't belong. It's the same sky you've watched your whole life, but now it hangs wrong, too wide, too fast, too full of something you can't name. It doesn't speak with the same seasons. It no longer whispers cold or carries the clean stillness of snow. Now it stirs with a strange warmth, wet and heavy like the breath of something alive beneath the clouds. You wait for the familiar rhythm of the frost, the crunch underfoot, the clean silence after snowfall. But it doesn't come. Instead, the air smells of rain. You've never trusted the rain. Where once there was ice, now there is water, too much of it. Glaciers retreat like wounded beasts, carving open the land behind them. They don't leave peace in their wake. They leave rawness, chaos, gaping valleys filled overnight with rivers, lowlands turning into floodplains, entire lakes where dry land should be. The world is soaking itself, saturating. drowning the maps you once followed without question. The places that held memory, the sacred trails, the old campsites, the trusted fords vanish beneath the churn. Every time you return to a familiar bend in the land, it's changed. Bent, broken, softened by water and time. Your shelter leaks. Your fires hiss and die in damp wind. There is no rhythm to rely on anymore, only a shifting, muddy pulse beneath your feet. You begin walking differently. Not to hunt, not entirely. You walk to understand. You walk because staying still in this new world feels like a slow drowning. And in your walking, you begin to see things that disturb you and things that fascinate you. Where the glaciers carved away stone, new earth lies exposed, black, rich, and steaming in the spring sun. And from that disturbed soil, things begin to grow, fast, unfamiliar, fragile at first, then bold. Strange shoots, wide leaves, some poisonous, some sweet. Some that make your stomach turn and some that linger on your tongue like fire and memory. These plants weren't here before. You've gathered since you could walk. You know which mushrooms curl in cold soil and which berries soften after frost. You know what numbs the pain of a bone wound and what leaves you twitching by the fire. But now the rules have changed. Entire ecosystems bloom overnight, plants that weren't part of your grandmother's stories. Trees you don't have names for. Roots that resist rot even after a flood. Grains that stay firm in your pouch even after weeks in the rain. You begin testing. Carefully, quietly. A new kind of attention settles in your body, not the sharp focus of the hunt, but the patient observation of the forager. You watch what the birds eat. You watch where the deer nibble. You watch which plants come back again and again, no matter the storm. It's not instinct anymore. It's something more deliberate. You're not just surviving, you're beginning to select. And without realizing it, you are watching the earth change its logic. This is no longer the world of abundance and scarcity, of feast or famine. This is a world of patterns, of consequences. And you are learning to see it not as a passive wilderness, but as something responsive, something you might shape. You don't have the word cultivation, but you feel it in your bones when you return to a clearing you left weeks ago and see the same stalks rising from where you dropped your scraps. You feel it when the roots you planted near your shelter are fuller than the wild ones. You don't think of it as farming, not yet. You think of it as cleverness. The floods don't stop. The weather twists and turns with no warning. Drought follows flood. Warmth collapses into sleet. But through it all, certain plants thrive. The ones near the hearth. The ones near the ash. The ones you touched. And for the first time, it occurs to you that maybe the world isn't punishing you with chaos. Maybe it's testing what survives. And not just what survives, but who pays attention. You begin to carry seeds without knowing why. A handful of something small and bitter in your pouch. A cluster of grain heads tied to your belt. Not for eating, just to have. You don't ask why. But some part of you knows these things matter. These are not just plants. These are memory embodied. These are stories that grow. The people around you notice too, quietly. Some of them laugh when you scatter seeds near the fire pit. Others start doing it themselves. The children mimic you. One day you find a row of stones marking where someone, maybe your daughter, tried to plant a line of stalks. And it worked. They're growing. Not wild, placed. It's not organized, it's not agriculture, not yet, but it's the beginning of attention, of intention. Still, not everything you grow is life. Some of it is death. One root you trusted turns to rot and sickness in the flood-soaked soil. A bitter berry you thought was safe twists your stomach into knots. This new world doesn't yield easily. It tests your curiosity with consequences. But you learn. And each lesson, each failed planting, each lucky guess becomes a quiet memory etched into your muscle, your blood. Because something else is growing in you too. The old stories no longer explain this world. The spirits of ice and mammoth don't speak here. The gods of the frozen hunt are silent, but something new stirs in the mud. Not a god, not a beast, an idea, soft, rooted, insistent. You might not have to chase the world anymore. You might grow your place in it. It's a terrifying thought, and a seductive one, because if it's true, then maybe, just maybe, this chaos isn't the end. Maybe it's a clearing, maybe it's a question, maybe it's an invitation. You still walk, but now you walk with seeds in your hand, not just to feed yourself, but to test the world, to see where it opens, where it welcomes, where it holds. And in those tiny green cracks, in the silence between storms, you begin to glimpse something almost impossible. A future that stays. A future not built on the bones of the last great hunt, but on the soft, persistent logic of what grows back. And as the sky shifts once again, as another wave of rain begins to fall on the torn-up earth, you don't run. You kneel. And begin again. You didn't mean to plant them, not really. There was no ceremony, no plan, no conscious leap into a new world. It started with scraps, the way everything does. Leftover grains, a dropped pouch, a lazy flick of your wrist as you tossed chaff into the wind. You were clearing space by your shelter, maybe feeding birds, maybe feeding fire. It didn't feel like a decision. But weeks later, there they were, green stalks, thin, unfamiliar, but unmistakably alive, sprouting from the place where you had forgotten something and the earth remembered. You crouched beside them, not in awe, but in confusion. How? Why here? Why now? You don't have words for germination or root systems. But your brain, honed by hunger and instinct and pattern recognition, begins to turn. You reach out. You touch the stalks. You feel a tremor in your chest, something subtle but undeniable, a sense of connection, as if the world had answered a question you hadn't asked yet. And so you do it again. Not because you believe in farming. You don't. That word doesn't exist. That concept isn't born yet. You do it because you're curious, because something in you needs to know if it was a fluke or a rule. You start small, a scattering of grain near the fire pit, a few seeds pressed into the softer soil by the river's bend, a handful buried near the edge of a shelter wall where the sun lingers longer. And each time you wait. What you're waiting for isn't just food. It's confirmation that the world responds, that the things you do matter not just now but later. This is agriculture, though you don't yet call it that. It isn't a revolution. It isn't sudden. It's hesitant, accidental, clumsy, but it's alive. And it begins to shape the way you move. You start choosing your camps differently, not just based on where the game runs or the fish gather, but on where the soil is soft, where the wind won't strip seedlings, where the water won't drown the roots. You walk with a pouch now, not just for food but for seeds, things to scatter, things to try, things to remember. You don't call it planting, you call it trying. Because failure still comes often. The floods rot your sprouts. The sun scorches new shoots. Some seeds vanish, never to return. Others come back wrong, bitter, stunted, diseased. You taste death at the edge of progress. You learn caution. You learn patience. But slowly, season by season, something changes. You notice which grains hold their shape through storms. You see which roots return even after fire. You begin selecting, not just gathering, not just hopping, but choosing. You are no longer a passive recipient of the earth's mood swings. You are becoming something else, a participant, a quiet force, a shaper. And still it's not conscious. Not in the way later generations will describe it, with diagrams, with plows, with fields drawn in perfect lines. This is older. This is intuitive. You don't farm because you know how. You farm because you notice. Because your ancestors survived the ice by watching the sky and following the herds. And now you're watching the ground, following the plants, listening not for hoofbeats but for growth. And in doing so, you begin to imagine something you've never imagined before. A future. Not just tomorrow's hunt or next moon's shelter, but next season, next year. You begin to wonder what might happen if you stay close to the things you've planted, if you tend to them, not just scatter them and walk away. You wonder what it would mean to stay long enough to reap. This thought is terrifying. Because to stay means to risk, to stake yourself in one place, to lose the safety of movement. But it also means something else, control, not full control, not mastery, but influence, agency, a sliver of say in how your hunger is answered. The others in your group begin to see it too. They don't talk about it directly, but you notice them lingering near the plants you seeded, children playing among stalks, elders chewing grains that you once thought useless. You're no longer just foraging, you're remembering, you're refining. And slowly the idea begins to spread, not like wildfire but like roots under soil. Quiet, invisible, inevitable. It doesn't replace the hunt. Not yet. You still need meat. Still track deer and boar and waterfowl. Still move with the seasons, watching the sky for signs of storm. But something else has entered the rhythm now, something slower, more deliberate. A pulse beneath the pulse. Because the seeds you drop aren't just food. They are hope. A gamble cast forward. A bet that the world won't collapse before they rise. A belief, however small, that what you plant today might feed someone tomorrow. You don't yet realize how radical this is. For hundreds of thousands of years, your species has been defined by reaction, by adaptation. You ran from storms. You hunted what moved. You survived because you were flexible, because you didn't demand anything of the earth except the chance to follow it. But now, with these seeds in your hand, you are asking for more. You are asking the earth to respond, and it does. Sometimes with failure, sometimes with fire, but sometimes gloriously with green. And in that green, you glimpse something larger than survival. Continuity. Not just between seasons, but between generations. You begin to wonder if you could pass this knowledge down, not as story, but as practice. Not just a tale around the fire, but a living memory embedded in the soil. This is where the future begins. not in grand architecture or written language or city walls, but here, in the muddy palm of a hunter who noticed something grow where nothing should have, in the quiet shift from gathering to tending, from wandering to returning. You still do not call it progress. You call it luck, or instinct, or maybe blessing. But the truth is deeper than any of those words. You've begun to shape the land, and in doing so, the land has begun to shape you. And in your calloused hands, your sunburnt back, your watching eyes, something ancient flickers to life. The first seeds of time. Because when you plant, you do something unthinkable. You believe that the world will still be here tomorrow. And that you will be too. You stand atop a hill that doesn't feel like a hill. Not really. It rises strangely, too symmetrical, too soft beneath your feet. Beneath the soil is something vast. You don't know it yet, but you're walking on top of a memory not yours, but one buried long before anyone wrote anything down. A place once thought to be sacred. A place you believe you've come to worship. But maybe you came here to plant. The wind here is different. It carries dust and heat, yes, but also silence. A silence thick with purpose, with design. Around you, limestone rings form strange enclosures. Massive T-shaped pillars jut from the earth like bones of forgotten giants. They seem too precise, too intentional for a people who supposedly still wandered. But you're here, and you're not wandering. You step carefully, reverently between the stones. Some are carved with animals you recognize: leopards, cranes, serpents. Others are abstract, filled with patterns that tug at something deep in your mind. Not quite language, not quite art. Symbols of a different kind of memory. The kind you feel in your body before you understand it with your mind. This place is old, older than cities, older than writing, older even than the pyramids, but not aimless, not random. You think it might be a temple, a place to connect with something higher. But look closer and the truth becomes stranger. This isn't just sacred space, it's cultivated space. Because between the stones, beneath the carvings, archaeologists found something unexpected. Not idols, not weapons, but seeds, grains, einkorn wheat, wild barley, traces of figs, tiny remnants of plants that do not grow easily here, not without help, not without care. So what were you doing here, really? Maybe you gathered not to praise the gods, but to feed them, to nourish them. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Perhaps these grains were the gods, not in the literal sense, but in the emotional one. Because in a world of uncertainty, of droughts, of floods, of predators and permafrost, a seed that grows is more than food. It's a promise, a symbol that tomorrow might exist. And these were the first promises you could hold. You don't build monuments like this unless you plan to stay. And you don't stay unless you can eat. So maybe this wasn't a temple that gave birth to agriculture. Maybe it was agriculture that gave birth to the temple, a place where people returned not just to pray, but to plant. The soil around Göbekli Tepe is stubborn. It demands effort, irrigation, protection, but you came anyway. You gathered with others. You shaped stone into rings, not for shelter, not for war, but for ritual. And in the center of that ritual stood something shockingly practical: food. Because calories, not copper, are the currency of civilization. And grain, not gold, is what lets humans gather in numbers large enough to dream of permanence. The pillars you raised weren't just to honor spirits. They were bookmarks, markers, a way to remember the places where growth was possible, where life, fragile, fickle life, had begun to anchor itself. And in anchoring the land, it anchored you. There's no clear line between garden and shrine here, no boundary between labor and faith. You offered sweat to the soil, and in return it gave you bread. It gave you story, and eventually it gave you identity. Because when you feed from the same ground season after season, something strange begins to happen. You stop being just people, you become a people, bound not just by blood or tribe, but by location, by shared cycles. You rise and fall with the harvest. You bury your dead in fields you once sowed. And in places like Göbekli, you record that memory not in ink, but in stone. Carved animals tell you what once roamed here. Carved hands and arms suggest rituals you've forgotten but once lived. And somewhere in the dust, there's a quiet truth that modern minds nearly missed. These weren't just monuments to gods. They were monuments to growth, to a new kind of power. Because the greatest change in human history didn't come with spears or ships. It came with grain, with patience, with the decision to stay. And Göbekli Tepe, long thought to be just a temple, may have been one of the first places that decision crystallized into architecture. But nothing lasts forever. At some point, for reasons no one fully understands, you buried it all. Not in collapse, not in conquest, but deliberately, carefully. You covered the stones, hid the symbols, left the grain behind. Why? Was it a ritual goodbye to a place that had served its purpose? A symbolic act of closure as you moved to more fertile valleys? Or was it a recognition, conscious or not, that what had once been sacred was now ordinary? That planting, once miraculous, had become routine? No one knows. But you left it there, under layers of soil and time, a fossilized garden of meaning, a forgotten altar to the thing that changed everything, the seed. Thousands of years would pass before anyone uncovered it again, and when they did, they searched first for gods, for myth, for signs of divine inspiration. But the truth was quieter, more grounded. Göbekli wasn't just a place of worship. It was a place of work, of waiting, of watching plants rise from dirt and believing, even if you couldn't explain why, that this process was holy. You weren't building temples to honor gods. You were building them because you had discovered something even more powerful: the ability to grow your own future. And that future, still fragile, still uncertain, needed a place to root. So you gave it one. And in doing so, you gave us one too. You thought it was your idea. You believed you were the one in control, that you had chosen which plants to keep, which to tear out, which to eat, and which to scatter again beside your shelter. You believed the ground bent to your will. But beneath your feet something else was unfolding, something slower, stranger, more intimate than conquest. You didn't know that while you were shaping the land was shaping you. The wild grains you returned to year after year began to shift. You noticed they grew taller in some places, fatter in others, But you didn't understand that the ones easiest to gather were also the ones most likely to be replanted. Not by plan, not by foresight, but by the simplest logic of survival. What thrives gets repeated. What scatters poorly stays near you. What shatters underfoot disappears. And so they changed. Their seeds grew heavier, too heavy to disperse alone. Their husks thickened. Their rhythms adjusted to yours. These plants became dependent on your fire pits, your footsteps, your habits, and in doing so they rewrote themselves. But not alone. Your spine bent forward, just slightly. A new curve born from hours stooped over rows of grain. Your knees hardened, your joints learned repetition. Your teeth wore differently now, ground down by the grit of stone-milled flour. Inside you, your gut began to realign. Bacteria that had once evolved for mastodon and marrow gave way to a community better suited for starch and seed. You were adapting silently, not by choice but by proximity, by participation. Your body became a new kind of record, a living archive of meals eaten and labors repeated. Your skeleton began to whisper truths that your myths hadn't yet caught up to. This wasn't a one-way relationship. This was a merger. You weren't just domesticating wheat. It was domesticating you. And it happened so slowly that you didn't notice. There was no line you could point to, no morning when you woke up and realized you crossed some biological threshold. Instead, your children simply grew up in a different world. One with fewer migratory muscles, one with smaller jaws, one where the future was determined not by the chase, but by the harvest. This wasn't the kind of revolution you thought it was. It wasn't fire or bronze or war. It was a quiet tethering, a feedback loop, a reshaping of flesh and soil and ritual into something neither plant nor human had seen before: codependence. And in that codependence, something new took root, a different idea of time, a different kind of risk. Because now, when the rains failed, it wasn't just the wild animals that vanished. It was your grain, your meal, your children's future. You had bound yourself to a system that asked for planning, for storage, for surrendering part of your body to something that offered no guarantees. You had moved from predator to partner, from forager to farmer, from free to fed. And it would change not just how you ate, but how you lived, how you worshipped, how you built. But that story, the one of villages, of temples, of surplus and hierarchy, was still waiting just ahead. For now, all you knew was this: the ground was no longer just beneath you. It was within you. And it would never let you go. You start to burn the land. Not in rage, not in carelessness, but in understanding. A slow, dawning recognition that what scorches also seeds. That flame is not just an end, it can be a beginning. So you gather tinder, wait for the dry season, and strike flint to stone. Fire races across the brush, trees crack, smoke climbs. But when the ash settles, what remains is not ruin, it is opportunity. The earth, blackened and bare, pulses with something new. You kneel, dig your hands into it. The soil is warm, soft, strangely alive. And when you scatter your seeds, the ones you've been saving, trading, protecting, they take root faster, stronger. The sprouts come earlier, taller, greener. You haven't read a theory, you haven't done an experiment, but you remember. The last time you burned this patch, the roots came back quicker. The animals lingered longer. The berries returned sweeter. So you do it again, not as destruction but as rhythm, as ritual. This isn't slash and burn farming as it will one day be named by strangers far in the future. It is older, gentler, more intimate, a form of proto-agriculture built not on control but on cooperation, on reciprocity. You feed the land with flame, and in return it feeds you. And you are not alone. Across continents, across oceans, others like you have made the same discovery. In Australia, the first peoples pass fire through grasslands to call forth kangaroos. In the Amazon, ancient hands sculpt dark earth with charcoal and bone, coaxing the forest to offer more. In North America, tribes light the prairie to summon bison and berry. None of you share a language, but you share an instinct that fire is not just wild. It can be wielded. You become firekeepers, not firefighters. You carry coals in bark bundles. You guard flame like treasure, because without it the land forgets how to give, and you forget how to live. The charred soil is a ledger, a living memory of what once grew and what might grow again. Your children learn to read it even if they never write a word. They watch the way mushrooms rise after the burn, how birds come back first, how the trees return slower but stronger. You pass down these lessons not in scrolls but in songs, in seasons. This knowledge spreads, not like conquest but like wind. It leaps from one camp to another, carried by migrants and marriages and meals shared under smoky skies. Fire becomes a quiet code, inscribed in the landscape itself. And with every burn, the boundary between wild and cultivated blurs a little more. You do not know chemistry, but you know that the soil, now blackened and soft, will feed you better. You do not understand nitrogen cycles or microbial regeneration, but you see the harvest. You taste the difference, and that is enough. You are becoming something new. A fire user, a land listener, a seed bringer. You no longer just take from the earth. You shape it, nurture it, co-create with it. And through flame, a new relationship is forged, not of dominance but of stewardship. And in that relationship, something ancient catches hold. The idea that destruction can be sacred, that in burning you clear the way for rebirth. The forest doesn't fear you, it waits for you. And so you walk forward, ember in hand, into a future only just beginning to grow. You never meant to grow anything. The land was supposed to feed you, not listen to you, but something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly like breath over a glassy pond. You follow the same trails every season, to the berry thickets, to the roots that grow under that familiar bend in the riverbank. You urinate there, you discard the spoiled, you leave behind what you no longer need, but the land remembers. Seasons pass. You notice the berries seem thicker near the old fire pit, the roots stronger where the ash fell. You think it's luck. You think maybe the spirits smiled. But deep inside, your brain is mapping these coincidences. You begin to favor certain places. You begin to leave the best seeds behind, not because you understand what they are, but because they're too small, too bitter, too much trouble to carry. The wild begins to echo you. Not tame, not yet, but familiar, changed. Where your people move, the ground blooms, not wildly, not evenly, but undeniably. The line between wilderness and influence blurs. You walk, you eat, you rest, and unknowingly you cultivate, not with intention but with routine. Your waste becomes nourishment. Your fire becomes fertilizer. The discarded rind, the crushed seed, all part of a system you don't yet perceive but participate in all the same. No one told you how to grow food. No one needed to, because food began growing around you, in your footsteps, in your patterns, in the invisible weave between habit and habitat. This is not yet a farm, but it is no longer a forest. And so the wild begins to shape itself around your choices. It bends toward you ever so slightly, a slope of probability, a drift of chance molded by action. You feel it in the roots that appear sooner, in the leaves that seem easier to reach. The world isn't yielding, it's responding. Others don't see it, not yet, but you do. You begin to favor these small places. You return more often. You share their bounty. And then, without ever using the word, you begin to protect them. A glance, a gesture, a caution passed to a child. These spots are special. You are not cultivating fields, but you are cultivating memory, not in your head, in the land. And the land remembers more than you do. The rains shift, the animals migrate, but these places, these micro-worlds of abundance, they return, year after year. They are the early whispers of permanence in a world still ruled by flux. You don't write maps, you walk them, and the invisible harvest grows in the lines of your journey. There are no fences, there are no rules, just rhythm, pattern, presence. And in this presence something is blooming, the first sense that the wild can be shaped, that the land is not just a giver but a partner. You don't yet plant, but something has been planted in you. An idea. And soon that idea will grow roots. It begins with the way grain lingers, not just in the fields or in your pouch, but in your day. You can't just eat and move. You have to dry it, pound it, soak it, grind it. Suddenly, your food doesn't chase you. You chase time. You stay, at first for days, then for moons. There's the drying season, the pounding season, the storing season. Each one gives shape to the next, and so you remain. The shelter grows sturdier. The hearth expands. You dig a pit to hide the sacks from rodents. You hang roots in woven nets. These aren't structures of comfort, they're structures of memory, of need. And others see it. They smell the ash. They see the smoke. They come with offerings, sometimes weapons, sometimes kin. And you share, you trade, you argue, but most of all, you coordinate. You don't build a village out of sentiment. You build it out of digestion, because roots rot, seeds mold, and food hoarded in one stomach dies with the hoarder. But food shared, food stored, food tracked, that becomes more than survival. It becomes structure. Someone watches the sacks. Someone tallies the roots. Someone remembers which pit is safe, which bark keeps the bugs away. These roles don't feel like power. They feel like responsibility. But every responsibility carries a seed of hierarchy. You don't see it yet, but the moment you sit, the moment you choose not to move with the herds, you've entered a new timeline, a slower one, a heavier one. Your muscles change. Your children grow up knowing boundaries. Paths form between hearths. The word for mine gets heavier. The The word for hours becomes complicated. The village doesn't start with a plan. It starts with leftovers, with rot and preservation, with the ache of work that cannot be done alone. You didn't mean to settle, but your food did. And now you live in its shadow. You stay longer in one place. Not because of comfort, not because of shelter, but because your hunger leaves you no choice. Grain must be dried, tubers must be dug, seeds must be protected not just from the wind or the cold, but from the mice, the beetles, and the desperate hands of other humans. Food doesn't just nourish you anymore. It commands you. You begin to build, not cities, not monuments, just what's necessary. A low wall to keep out the rain, a raised slab to keep the roots from rotting, a fire pit that stays warm longer than a night. These are not signs of ambition. They are signs of digestion. You don't create shelter for safety. You create it because your food needs time. Hearths first, then storage, then walls. The structure grows not all at once, but layer by layer, like the rings of a tree, like the seasons you're starting to name. The harvest season, the grinding season, the storing season, the lean season. Time no longer moves in wild, unpredictable bursts. It moves in loops, in routines, in rhythms shaped by roots, by stalks, by cycles of mold and abundance. You become a manager of decay. You learn to outpace rot, to smoke, to dry, to wrap leaves around things that spoil. You bury sacks in pits and line the sides with ash. You tie bundles of grass to hang food from the ceiling. You plan. Because now, food isn't just what you find. It's what you keep. And keeping it demands that you remember. So you stay. At first, just for a while, long enough to finish the harvest, long enough to guard the seed stash, long enough to see the sprouts emerge from the accidental scatterings near the fire pit. But soon, the seasons pull at you. They tell you when to stay, not your muscles or your migrations. You begin to obey your food. And others notice. They come, some to trade, some to join, some to steal. You watch their hands, you watch their feet. Are they here to help dig or here to empty your stores? You begin to judge strangers not by their strength or song, but by what they do near the grain pile. You begin to understand the power of food as leverage, as diplomacy, as danger. Someone guards the sacks. Someone checks for mold. Someone tells the children to stay away from the sprouting grain because you've learned that's poison now. There are new rules, rules no one wrote down, but you feel them heavy as stones in your gut. You don't realize it yet, but this is administration. This is hierarchy. One person remembers where the wild yams grow thickest. Another knows how deep to dig without bruising them. One of you builds better baskets. Another, better traps. You all still share, but not evenly, not without memory. You start to notice who gives, who takes, who cheats, who forgets. Social memory starts to bloom in your bones like instinct once did. And instinct begins to fade. You don't run toward herds now. You plan for months of waiting. You don't leap over rivers. You bridge them. You don't chase weather. You predict it. Your body hasn't evolved fast enough to know what this means, but your mind has started to specialize. Your brain begins to wire itself around patterns of delay, around ideas of storage, around future hunger that hasn't arrived yet but will. This is the beginning of anxiety. Not the kind that saves your life from a predator, but the kind that creeps in when you look at your food pile and wonder, will it last? Is there enough? What if the rains don't come? What if they come too much? You don't just eat now. You calculate, you ration, you plan for mouths that haven't been born yet. Hunger doesn't just live in your belly anymore. It lives in your calendar. And because your food waits, you wait. You build more, a trench for runoff, a clay-lined pit to keep the rodents out, a barrier of thorns that doesn't just protect you, it defines a boundary, a line in the earth between you and what's outside, what's wild, what's still moving. Inside the line, a village. But you don't call it that. You just call it home, or maybe just here. A place where others come back to again and again. A place with rules and roles and things that belong to us and not them. You don't need a word for village to be living in one. You only need to lose something here, to leave and come back and find your footprints waiting. The child born here doesn't remember the migration paths, doesn't remember the feel of a full stomach after a lucky chase. They remember chores. They remember the time of planting and the smell of smoke in the morning. They remember a world where food doesn't appear, it is coaxed, stored, earned. The village begins not with law, but with leftovers. With the food that outlasts your body's demand, with the rot you prevent, with the work you share. You didn't plan it. You didn't envision it. You didn't sketch blueprints in the dirt and call it civilization. But here you are, surrounded by storage pits and drying racks, by hearths that never fully go cold. You sleep near your seeds, your roots, your memories. You wake to the sound of someone grinding grain, someone humming, someone digging in the ash pile for yesterday's warmth. You think you stayed here because it was easy. But the truth is, you stayed here because hunger asked you to. Because the food you harvested needed time and time needed walls. The village didn't begin in the mind. It began in the gut. In the quiet knowing that food is the first anchor, that to nourish others, to prepare for what doesn't yet exist, that is the beginning of everything. And you're starting to understand. What you feed feeds you back. You walk through the old clearing, but something in the ground feels different. 2 winters ago, this was where the roots grew thick and easy. The soil then was soft and dark, full of the quiet richness that made your digging stick sink without protest. Now, the earth resists you. It clings to your fingers with a dull, pale grit. Something has changed, and though you can't name it, your hands know the truth before your thoughts do. You try anyway. You dig deeper, slower, more carefully, as if the soil might give you an answer if you just listen long enough. There's no map in your hand, no record on hide or clay. But the dirt itself whispers. Its smell is sharp now, metallic, less alive. Its texture clumps where it once crumbled. And as you crouch there in the fading light, it strikes you. The land remembers. This is your first archive. Not carved in stone or etched in bone, but embedded in the touch of earth. In how the roots spread, in how the grain bent, in how the worms moved. Every harvest leaves a mark. Every season tells a story. And slowly your fingertips become readers, not of text, but of texture. You begin to remember the soil, the way your ancestors remembered stars. Where it was richest, where the worms danced after rain, where a strange bitter weed grew and made your children sick. You store these memories in your body, not in words, but in instinct, in ritual, in rhythm. You walk past a hill and feel it in your chest, not here. This patch didn't feed you last year. It took more than it gave. You don't make that mistake twice. And so you record. Not with ink, not with symbols, with paths, with stories, with songs your children sing as they scatter seeds, the tale of the low field that floods too fast, the one about the red moss that warns of tired land, the chant that lists which soil takes roots, which soil breaks them. Each fable carries a hint of agronomy. Each myth hides a map. You may not have writing, but you have memory, and dirt remembers with you. It begins with your hands, but it doesn't end there. Your feet learn too the give of soft earth, the sting of dry ground. Your nose becomes an instrument. Damp earth smells like safety. Sour earth like danger. Every harvest changes you. Every planting season refines your senses. You aren't just growing food anymore. You're growing knowledge. Beneath your calluses, a new kind of intelligence blooms. One that can't be taught, only inherited. Your child doesn't know the word nitrogen, but they know not to plant in the same patch again and again. They've seen the wilted stalks. They've smelled the rot. And they remember, because you made them remember, with stories, with caution, with consequence. Because forgetting now costs lives. A single poor yield isn't just a bad year, it's a winter of hunger. A season of weakness that leaves you vulnerable to rivals, to storms, to sickness. So you don't forget. You can't afford to. Your survival depends on the memory of the ground. And slowly, without ever meaning to, you become historians. Not of people, of places. Each footstep marks a lesson. Each furrow is a sentence. Each burned field is a warning. And over generations, these records deepen. The knowledge thickens like compost. Layer upon layer of lived experience, of successes and mistakes, building into something you can feel underfoot, something invisible but undeniable. Soil becomes something sacred, not in the way of gods or spirits, but in the way of breath, of food, of continuity. You start to treat it not as background, but as partner. You no longer ask simply, what can I take from this ground? You start to ask, what does it need in return? You leave fields fallow. You test new spots. You observe how ash changes the texture, how manure deepens the blackness. You experiment not with theories, but with hunger. Science begins here. Not in laboratories, but in mistakes you survive. You discover crop rotation not with charts, but with aching bellies. You learn restoration through failure, through fields that collapse, through plots that bloom again years later. Nature isn't something you watch anymore. It's something you collaborate with. Your tools are still bone and stick, but your mind is shifting into something far stranger, something predictive. And the land responds. Fields that were once silent begin to reveal themselves. You see how soil clings differently after floods, how gravel sings underfoot when it's too dry. You smell sulfur in places that once yielded sweet tubers, and you know something is sick here. The ground speaks now, and you're beginning to understand its language. You don't write, but you remember. In rings of fire pit ash, in piles of broken husks, in patterns of shadow where trees once grew, your village becomes a living memory, not of stories told aloud, but of relationships with the earth itself. You don't call it a system. You don't call it farming science, but it is, rooted not in the mind but in the ground beneath your bare feet. You are planting in two places now, in the field and in the future. And as your children press seeds into the same dirt you once turned, you wonder if they'll remember the way you did, if they'll notice the tilt of the land, the subtle shift in moisture, the way the crows arrive earlier each season. You hope so, because the soil remembers, but only if you listen. And already something new is rising beyond the fields, something shaped by memory, but reaching beyond it. A pattern, a practice, a kind of power. One you didn't mean to cultivate, but have, nonetheless. And it's beginning to spread. You didn't think the grain would matter this much. At first, it was just something to store, to keep dry, to keep close. But then the animals came. At night, you'd hear their hooves trampling the shoots, pigs rooting through the soft dirt, deer nibbling at green blades too tender to survive. You began sleeping lighter, rising earlier, watching the edges of the field more than the sky. Hunger had once come from nature's scarcity. Now it came from its abundance, the way it attracted everything with a nose and a need. You fought back with noise at first, with fire, with shouting, but the animals didn't listen. They didn't care that you had planted here. They didn't recognize your effort, so you began to mark the edge. Thorns at the perimeter, a ring of dry brush, then sticks sharpened and pushed deep into the earth not as weapons but as warnings. The first fence was not a wall, it was a plea, a declaration unspoken but understood. This is mine. I depend on this. Please leave it alone. But nature doesn't ask permission, and neither do people. Soon it wasn't just wild animals pressing in. It was other humans, strangers from the nearby valley, distant cousins who hadn't planted that season, even friends who began to linger longer than they used to, hands hovering near your grain stores, eyes calculating. You offered some the first time, but they came back. They always came back. And the more you gave, the more you realized that giving had no bottom. That need, once seen, becomes expectation. That generosity can feel like weakness when your own stomach starts to gnaw at itself. So you reinforced the edge. A proper fence this time. Stone where the land allowed it, brush woven thick, a pattern the children were taught to build before they could even walk far from the hearth. You weren't just protecting food now, you were protecting the future, the calories you would need later, the seeds saved for next season, the work already done. Ownership didn't start with greed, it started with memory. You remembered the time you almost starved, the child whose fever outlasted the winter, the mouths too small to beg and too many to feed. So you drew a line in the soil not out of pride but out of fear. And when someone crossed it, something inside you hardened. It had to. Because without that line, there was no survival. And that's when the world shifted. The fence became more than a barrier. It became an idea, an extension of your intention, a visible claim to something invisible: effort, time, planning, work. You had bent nature not with violence but with vision. You had turned wilderness into possibility, and now, with the edge marked clearly, it was yours. At least, that's what you told yourself. But a fence is not just about what's inside. It also defines what's outside. It creates the idea of the other, those who don't belong, those who take, who threaten, who don't understand what it cost you to coax life from soil. And once the line is drawn, the questions begin. Who gets to cross it? When? For what reason? And who gets to decide? You didn't invent territory, but the moment you fenced off a patch of earth and dared to say mine, you reshaped how humans think. Because now land had a shape, a purpose, a price. And with land came power. Not everyone could fence a field. Not everyone had the resources to build, to protect, to hold. Those who could began to hold more. Families grew around plots. Clans clustered near fertile edges. And with every generation the fences crept outward, first to enclose food, then water, then space. Territory wasn't a philosophy. It was a stomach with a memory. And soon, those who had land had leverage. Fences became politics. Who gets to plant where? Who gets to harvest first? Who enforces the line when someone steps over it? You start teaching children not just how to dig or thresh or grind, but how to guard, to watch, to remember who belongs where. And for those on the outside, a new feeling blooms, a bitterness, a resentment. Because the fence doesn't just keep them out, it reminds them of what they lack. You didn't mean to start a conflict, but conflict comes anyway. It always does when there's something worth protecting. You begin to notice your neighbors watching your fences the way animals once watched your fields. You see the way they hover just beyond the perimeter, pretending not to stare. And you wonder if they remember the old days before the lines, when food was shared around fire, when no one owned a place, because place itself was just where you happened to be. That world is gone now. Because fences don't only change land, they change minds. They teach you to think in borders, in access, in belonging. They reshape time too, because now you're not just living from season to season. You're managing, forecasting, defending. Everything is invested. Everything is on the line. And when you lie awake at night, listening to the wind rattle the woven reeds along the boundary, you realize something unsettling. The fence that was supposed to protect your peace is also the thing that stole it. It worked. It kept the animals out. It warned the strangers. It marked what was yours, but it also made you anxious, guarded, wary. And now you begin to wonder if it's possible to draw a line in the dirt without also drawing one in the heart. Because every fence is a story, and not everyone agrees with how it ends. And as more fences rise across the valley, across distant hills, across whole continents, the lines begin to converge. And soon, something bigger than a village will rise from their shadows. A new kind of structure, one built not of wood or rock, but of rules. You didn't expect it to stay. The goat had wandered in from the hills, ribs like bent branches, eyes like wet stones. It had the look of something that didn't belong, not in your clearing, not in your plans. But hunger speaks the same language in every body. So you tossed it scraps. A heel of dried root, the rind of a gourd, nothing you'd miss. Nothing worth guarding, just a gesture, and for a moment that seemed to be enough. But the goat didn't leave. It lingered near the hearth, sleeping close to the outer fire where the warmth pooled thick and low. It watched you the way your child did with expectation, and every time you fed it, it grew bolder. Then it began to follow you. When you walked to the water, it came. When you dug the tubers, it watched. When danger stirred in the underbrush, it bleated, not with courage but with trust. And then, one day, its children were born beneath your roof. That's how it starts. Not with ropes, not with cages, but with proximity, with repetition. 1,000 tiny allowances. You don't call it domestication. You don't have that word. You just have the pattern: offer, stay, follow, multiply. And little by little, wildness wears a path to your door. But it isn't just the goat that changes. It's you. You used to run at the snap of a twig, at the whisper of fur in the trees. You used to move in cycles, chase, hide, chase again. But now you find yourself waiting, planning, saving some scraps in case the goat returns, changing your routines to protect her young, sleeping a little deeper because the world outside your firelight has become quieter. You didn't tame the goat alone. The goat tamed you too. Domestication is not a conquest, it's an exchange. A truce between survival and trust. And the deeper it goes, the more invisible it becomes. Because soon the animals that linger near your hut are no longer intruders. They are part of your rhythm. You learn which ones can be milked, which can be penned, which can be led with a branch and a soft voice. You begin to understand their moods, their hungers, their timetables, and they begin to understand yours. You are no longer just reacting to nature. You are co-writing it. But this shift is more than practical. It touches something quieter, something deeper. Because in taming the animal, you are also taming the unknown. Each goat that stays becomes a promise, a day's worth of milk, a child's blanket of wool, a feast for a winter that hasn't yet come. And with every promise fulfilled, your fear shrinks a little. It's not gone, but it's no longer wild. And neither are you. You start to notice the same tamming in yourself. You wake at regular times. You store food not just for the season, but for the storm. You know which herbs help fevers, which barks calm pain. You feel the world tightening around you, not as a trap, but as a shape. A home. And in this shape, something ancient softens. The part of you that once looked at every stranger as a threat now learns to bargain, to share, to trade. Because just as some animals stop running, some people stop raiding. Domestication spreads. It's viral but not violent. And its deepest work is in the small things, the patience to wait for ripened fruit, the gentleness to calm a skittish lamb, the foresight to build not just for the moment but for the year. You begin to see the world not as a chase, but as a system. Not as chaos, but as possibility. But taming is not without its cost. Because when you tether something, you inherit its limits. The goat no longer runs wild, but now it depends on you, and you depend on it. And that bond, that loop, begins to tighten. It requires time, protection, discipline. You can't just leave anymore. Your freedom narrows into care. And so does your identity. Once you were a gatherer, a tracker, a shadow in the trees. Now you're a keeper. of animals, of habits, of order. It feels right until it doesn't. Because with every tamed thing, there is loss. The goat no longer climbs as high, no longer vanishes into the fog. Its horns dull, its instincts soften. And you begin to lose the part of you that ran fast and lived wild. You exchange it for predictability, for safety, for control. And some days you miss it. The chaos, the chase, the hunger that sharpened your eyes and your mind. But those days are rare, because the world you've made is growing. More goats, more children, more food, more structure. And with each layer, your sense of the wild becomes more distant, like a dream you once had but forgot the moment you opened your eyes. Domestication is not a single act, it's an inheritance. It passes from parent to child, not as a story, but as a way of life. And eventually, you don't remember a time before the goat, or before the fence, or before the slow, rhythmic rituals that make your days feel full. But sometimes at night, when the wind slips through the walls and the fire dims low, you wonder, what else are you taming? Your instincts, your awe, your capacity for wonder. Because if you can shape the world, what part of the world is shaping you back? You don't know yet. But the answer is already growing. In the pens you build, in the routines you memorize, in the hands of your children who have never known a life without goats or grain. And in the morning, when the bleeding rises with the sun, you rise with it. Not as a hunter, not as a wanderer, but as a keeper of animals, of memory, of a new kind of future. You didn't mean to leave it behind. It was just a pouch of berries, shriveled and half frozen, crushed in the bottom of your basket, left too long by the hearth, warmed by weeks of slow, uneven sun. You only noticed it again when the smell began to rise. Sweet, sharp, alive in a way that made your mouth water and your stomach recoil at the same time. But you taste it anyway. And the moment it hits your tongue, something strange happens. A smile, not of joy, not yet, but of surprise. A tug in your chest, as if some ancient part of you recognizes something it never learned. The berries have changed. They are no longer what they were. And neither are you. This is your first encounter with fermentation, a chemical miracle hidden in decay, a partnership between life and rot, between control and surrender. And it begins not with a recipe, but with a mistake. A forgotten pouch, a mouthful of transformation. You don't know the word for it, but your body knows the feeling. Warmth, tingling, a lightness behind the eyes like fog lifting over a river at dawn. You feel looser, slower, but clearer somehow. And as the fire crackles and the night leans close, you realize something even more astonishing. You want to share it. Not just the taste, but the state, the altered rhythm, the softened mind. Fermentation isn't just a process. It's an invitation to forget, to forgive, to feel something different for a while. And once you've felt it, you begin to seek it. The sour milk that thickens overnight, strangely delicious. The bread that rises on its own, warm and hollowed with air. The tuber left buried too long, now tangy and soft. You begin to realize this isn't just food survival, it's food evolution. guided not by your hands but by invisible allies. Bacteria, yeast, thyme. You never see them, but you sense their work in bubbles, in smells, in shifts of flavor that defy logic but earn your trust. Fermentation becomes your quiet science. The first laboratory is a clay jar in a shaded corner, watched by children, opened by mothers, tasted by the brave. And what begins as an accident becomes a ritual. Because in a world without cold, without clocks, without clean, fermentation is a kind of magic. A way to keep what should have vanished. A way to eat what should have spoiled. A way to turn fleeting abundance into lasting sustenance. But something else starts to happen, too. As your jars multiply, as your meals swell with these strange living foods, your gatherings change. Meals are no longer silent, utilitarian. They become slower, louder, softer. There is laughter now, slurred words. Singing may be low and rhythmic like the pulse of a sleeping world. You don't just preserve calories. You ferment memory. And in this strange alchemy of rot and joy, culture begins to rise. Not the kind carved into stone, but the kind that bubbles in clay, shared through taste, through touch, through stories told a little too close to the fire. You begin to forget the strict lines between fresh and foul, between clean and unclean, because sometimes the mold that grows is medicine, sometimes the curdled milk is dinner, sometimes what smells like death is actually becoming life. Fermentation teaches you this. Not all change is visible, not all decay is loss. And in this realization lies something ancient, something holy. Because the microbes do not just preserve your food, they preserve your trust in time. You begin to understand that good things don't always arrive immediately, that waiting can be nourishment, that what rots can rise again. It reshapes how you see the world. A bruised fruit becomes a hope instead of a threat. A bubbling pot becomes a promise. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your fear of the unknown softens, because now you've tasted what mystery can become. But the lesson goes deeper still. Fermentation is not just chemistry. It is a kind of forgetting of what the berries used to be, of what the milk once was, of what you feared might happen if you didn't control every outcome. It teaches you to loosen your grip, to let microbes do what your hands cannot. And in that release, something stirs. You begin to see yourself differently, not as the sole maker of your world, but as a collaborator, a co-creator with time and chance and organism. You don't direct the process. You guide it. You taste and wait and respond. And somewhere in that dance, you become more human. Because this imperfect living transformation, is the root of so many things you'll one day call culture. Cheese, wine, beer, bread. But also story, celebration, ceremony. You begin to mark the seasons not just by weather but by flavor. You remember summers by the sweetness of fermented fruit, winters by the bite of sour roots. Even grief finds its ritual, a shared drink, a meal that lingers longer than hunger demands. Fermentation teaches you how to carry time, not as a burden, but as a vessel. And when you pass these foods to your children, you are not just feeding them, you are handing them memory, microbial inheritance, the taste of patience, the wisdom of mold. Because the truth is, nothing you eat is ever still. It is always changing, digesting, breaking down and building up again. And once you understand that, you begin to see your own story in the same light. You are fermenting too, softening, bubbling, becoming something you weren't yesterday. And not despite the forgetting, but because of it. Because sometimes, the past must go soft before it feeds the future. You can't always name the transformation while it's happening, but you can taste it, feel it, and you can trust that the sourness will, one day, make sense. You put the clay jar back in the shade, wrap it in cloth. You've learned how to wait. Not as punishment, but as promise. And tomorrow, or the day after, when you open it again, you'll find something new. Not just in the jar, but in yourself. You don't set out to divide the world. It begins slowly, without rules, without titles. You move as you always have, in patterns shaped by hunger and weather, by danger and hope. The men still go far, hunting shapes that vanish into trees. Their muscles track motion, their eyes scan distance. But the women stay. And in the staying, something begins. Their feet tread the same earth, day after day, not in conquest but in care. Their eyes linger longer on the ground. They watch how roots swell beneath shade, how berries come early after light rain. They notice when the soil feels softer, when a leaf changes color before the stalk. They remember what the wind was like last time the tubers split easily from the ground. They do not chart the land on bark or hide. They chart it in skin, in calluses and muscle memory. Their hands become maps not of territory but of nourishment, and in those hands seeds slip like promises, not carried, not scattered, placed. Placed where the earth is dark and loose, where last year's harvest left whispers of plenty, where the sun warms early and the rain lingers late. You don't have the word for farmer, not yet, but you know the feeling of dependence, of trust in the ones who stay. Because staying is not stillness, it's attention. It's remembering what fed you last season and daring to believe it will feed you again. And so the hearth becomes more than a fire. It becomes a center of drying, grinding, soaking, waiting, of conversation, repetition, prediction. And here, around this hearth, knowledge begins to thicken. Not knowledge of chase and kill, but of germination, of flowering, of cycles hidden beneath bark and soil. And the ones who tend this fire begin to hold something stranger than warmth. They hold time. And time begins to ripple. Because agriculture doesn't simply reshape the land, it reshapes how you live within it, how you organize your hours, your seasons, your roles. At first, it's subtle. A girl who knows which grain stores best, a mother who knows when not to plant, a grandmother who speaks in seeds and shadows and gut feelings that always prove true. Slowly, the memory of the world gathers in bodies, in gestures, in women who have become soil keepers, sprout readers, mold watchers. The land responds to them, and you begin to respond to that. You begin to listen. Because now, survival is not just teeth and spear. It's knowing when the frost will come, which seed needs soaking, which stalks grow bitter when the moon is wrong. It is knowledge too deep for hunting, too slow for war, and yet more powerful than both. Because while men still travel seeking movement, women stay and shape it, not in a straight line, but in circles, in rhythms, in seasons that teach you not to conquer the world but to synchronize with it. And in this slow realignment, something shifts. Power, not all at once, not everywhere, not cleanly, but undeniably. For the first time, those who remain do not just wait, they decide when to harvest, when to replant, when to share, when to store. The hearth is no longer just a resting place. It is a governance. And with it comes tension. Because knowledge gives authority, and authority demands boundaries. So roles begin to harden, not because anyone planned it, but because habit becomes structure, and structure becomes rule. Now you see lines where once there were none. Who grinds, who hunts, who plants, who speaks in council, who speaks at all. Gender becomes more than body. It becomes labor. And labor becomes identity. And yet, even within these lines, the soil remains honest. It does not care who scatters the seed, only that it finds a place to grow. And so the division is never total. You blur it again and again. A boy who watches his mother plant, a girl who tracks deer for days. The roles bend, crack, reform. Because the earth does not follow laws, it follows relationships. And your relationships are changing. What once was shared by movement, the hunt, the chase, is now shared by memory, by the passing of technique, the sharing of secrets, by songs hummed while grinding flour, stories told while weaving baskets, whispers traded between those who know the bitter root from the healing one. Knowledge, once scattered by distance, begins to settle in place. And with it, you begin to settle too. But every harvest carves deeper grooves. As food becomes more reliable, so does routine. And routine demands division. Not because of nature, but because of necessity. Someone must feed the fire, someone must watch the seed, someone must mend the tools, someone must keep the child alive. And the more specialized the tasks become, the more rigid the identities around them feel. Until one day, you don't even notice the shape of your own assumptions. They have grown as naturally as the fields around you. But buried deep in the grooves of these routines is still the echo of something wilder. Because gender, like land, is never fixed, it's shaped by what you ask of it, what you assign, what you allow to grow. And even now, as roles calcify, the land remains a teacher. It teaches that flexibility is survival, that adaptability is sacred, that even the hardest line can be softened by rain. So you return to the hearth, and you watch. The girl placing seeds in rows too neat to be random. The boy pressing flour into shapes his father would not understand. The woman teaching her granddaughter not just how to plant, but how to decide. And beneath it all, you feel the great quiet truth swelling. You did not inherit your roles. You cultivated them. And like any crop, they can be tended, they can be reimagined, they can be undone. Because nothing planted is ever final. And the gender of growing, like the growing itself, is never finished. It's only just beginning. You crouch by the edge of your field, the soil warm beneath your knees, and lift a single seed between your fingers. It is small, lighter than a breath, but inside it something stirs, a memory, a force, a future. You don't know the word for potential, not yet, but you feel it in your chest as you press that seed into the dirt, the quiet gasp of possibility. Not food today, but food tomorrow, if the rain comes, if the sun returns, if nothing interferes. And so a ritual begins. Not one with robes or chants, not yet, but a ritual of the hands, the breath, the waiting. You bury the seed. You cover it gently. You watch. You hope. You begin to believe. Because when you plant a seed, you are not just feeding yourself. You are making a wager against the unknown. That there will be a future. That something invisible will rise. And that belief is a kind of magic. It changes how you see everything. Now the fields are no longer empty. They are full of invisible life, hidden worlds trembling just beneath the surface. And when they burst forth, when the first green shoots pierce the crust of earth, you feel awe. Not pride, not ownership. Awe. The same awe you once felt beneath stars, or in the eyes of a newborn, or in the frozen breath of a successful hunt. But now it's here, in the dirt, in your hands, in something so small it should not be capable of so much. You begin to speak differently. Not just of food, but of favor, of spirits that smile when seeds grow well, of punishments when they rot. You carve images of stalks and leaves into your stones. You bury grains with your dead. You sing songs before planting, and you speak softly around the fields. The seed becomes more than a tool, more than sustenance. It becomes sacred, because it answers the greatest question your mind has ever asked. What will come after me? And the seed whispers, I will. It's a promise you can touch, one you can pass from hand to hand, from mother to daughter, from tribe to tribe. The seed becomes your language for permanence, for continuity, for the divine. And with divinity comes danger, because anything that gives life can also define power. And so the seed becomes guarded, stored in hidden places, measured, counted, protected, fought over. The hands that hold the seed begin to hold more than food, they hold fate. They decide who eats, who trades, who lives through winter, and slowly the sacred becomes strategic. The seed is not just buried in soil now. It is buried in myth. You speak of gods who taught you to plant, of ancestors who became stalks of wheat, of great floods that drowned the careless but spared those who honored the grain. Agriculture is no longer survival. It is worship. Not metaphorically, literally. The harvest becomes a ceremony. The drought becomes a judgment. You leave offerings at the edge of the field, bones, beads, blood, trying to balance your ledger with the unseen forces that sleep in the dirt. Because the seed doesn't always rise. Sometimes it dies. And when it dies, you want reasons. Not just seasons or pests or shadows, but reasons. And so you invent stories to explain the silence. You invent gods to explain the yield. You invent rituals to try again. The seed, once a tool of observation, becomes a key to meaning. And those who control meaning begin to lead. Priests rise from farmers. Temples rise from storage pits. What was once a circle of huts becomes a complex of granaries and shrines. You pray where you store your grain. You sacrifice where you dry your wheat. And the line between faith and food dissolves like dew in morning soil. But this reverence is not always peaceful, because belief makes you brave. And when one valley's seed grows stronger than yours, you do not ask what fertilizer they used. You ask what God they serve, what rituals they perform, what secrets they were given, and whether you are willing to take them. Agricultural faith becomes agricultural conquest. You raid not just for land, but for seeds. And the stories you tell about them carry the same double edge, worship and warning. This is how religion germinates. Not in the stars, but in the ground. In the cycle of life and death that repeats so perfectly, it begins to feel intentional. In the way you kneel to plant, as if in prayer. In the way your hands shake when the first green pierces the soil, as if you've been forgiven. And in the way your hunger turns into gratitude, and your gratitude into ritual, and your ritual into belief. The cult of the seed isn't superstition. It's pattern recognition that learned to speak in poetry. Because deep down, you don't just want to eat. You want to matter. You want to be part of something larger, older, stronger than yourself. And the seed offers you that. It offers you cycles. And cycles offer you meaning. But meaning can be wielded. So now, the ones who know how to store the seed, who name it, bless it, ration it, hold more than surplus. They hold stories. And stories are power. So you gather each spring at the edge of the fields. You chant. You light fires. You bury pieces of yourself in the ground, bones, blood, broken things, not to discard them, but to renew them. To say to the world, we are still here, we still believe, we will plant again. And every time the stalks rise, your faith grows deeper. Because faith, like the seed, doesn't require proof, only the willingness to wait. And you have learned to wait. You, the former hunter, the former wanderer, now the believer, the planter, the priest of a quiet, pulsing God made of roots and light and time. And deep in your heart, you feel the next truth pushing through. That what you worship becomes what you fear. And what you fear is what you obey. You run your fingers through the grain more than you've ever seen in one place. It pours like water, sings like rain, rustles like memory. You could feed 100 people, maybe more. You've never had this much before. And yet you don't feel safe. You feel watched. Because the moment there is more than enough, there is also someone who wants what you have. Abundance was supposed to mean peace. It was supposed to mean rest, security, relief from the gnawing mouth of hunger. But what you didn't expect was that plenty could provoke panic. That fullness could create fear. Once you fought to survive. Now you guard what you've survived for. Because this pile of grain is more than calories, it's power. It buys loyalty. It wins mates. It grants time to dream, to invent, to command. And so you store it, you stack it, you seal it in clay-lined pits. You build your first vaults with mud and fire. And then you begin to count. You mark the sacks, you memorize the weights, you notice who takes more than their share, and someone inevitably becomes the one who watches, who measures, who keeps the keys. That someone is no longer planting, no longer harvesting, no longer living like the rest. But they eat better. They sleep warmer. And slowly they speak louder. Because when food stops being a daily chase and becomes a seasonal stockpile, it starts to need management, oversight, protection, not just from storms or animals, but from each other. You build walls not just to keep the wild out, but to keep the horde in. And with walls comes difference. This one guards, that one tills, this one makes records, that one doesn't eat today. The same surplus that gave you stability now breeds inequality. And inequality doesn't come with a roar. It arrives like a whisper. You barely notice it at first, someone eating before the rest, someone claiming more because they watched over it. Someone's child receiving the best grain while yours gets the husks. But once it begins, it never unravels. It tightens. And it justifies itself. They call it order. They call it duty. They say someone must lead and someone must serve. But the hierarchy is written not in law, not yet, but in loaves. The bigger your share, the louder your voice. The more you store, the more you rule. The village that once shared a fire now divides its people by what they hold. Some hold tools, others ledgers, some bend their backs, others raise their hands, not in greeting but in command. You didn't plan this, but the seed you planted grew roots in places you didn't see. Because grain doesn't just grow food, it grows systems. And systems don't just grow prosperity. They grow control. The strongest person no longer needs to lift a spear. They only need to control access. Who gets the seed? Who gets the land? Who gets to eat tomorrow? Suddenly, violence no longer needs to be loud. It can be silent. It can look like rationing, like permission, like protocol. You've built a society around something beautiful, surplus, and now it begins to suffocate you, quietly, effectively, because you don't revolt when the bread is shared unevenly. You wait. You hope. You tell yourself next season will be fairer. But fairness isn't what surplus protects. It protects itself. It rewards those closest to it and punishes those who aren't. And now, punishment doesn't mean exile. It means hunger. Because hunger is still the oldest teacher, still the sharpest whip. But now it's used not by nature but by people. People who look like you, who once stood beside you in the fields, who now stand above. And the worst part is, you understand. Because when your child is full and another's is not, you look away. You say it's not your fault, that it's just how things are now. The new order, built not with swords, but with sacks. And what you once feared, famine, is replaced with something worse, enforced hunger, controlled hunger, weaponized hunger. A slow violence that doesn't leave bruises, just silence and obedience. The first fences were built to protect crops, the next were built to protect storage, and the ones after that, to protect those who no longer work the land but speak for it, through rules, through records, through rituals. Ritual becomes rule, rule becomes class, class becomes law. You look around and realize the more you store, the less you trust. The more you guard, the more you fear. And where you once gathered around a fire, you now line up behind a gate. Surplus was meant to free you. But freedom, it seems, is harder to manage than survival. Because now you don't just fear the wolves beyond the trees. You fear the gatekeeper. You fear the hunger that can be handed to you or withheld. You fear the fact that power no longer needs to run, it sits, watches, decides. And in the shadow of that stillness, you begin to ask yourself, is this what we wanted? Or is this what the seed wanted? Because once you could walk away, you could leave a bad season, a bad leader, a bad place. But now the grain is here. The tools are here. The children are here. And walking away means walking into hunger. So you stay. You obey. And the world you built with abundance begins to feel like a prison made of plenty. The violence doesn't always scream, but you feel it. In the way your voice carries less weight than a tally mark. In the way your worth is measured in what you produce. In the way grain, once a gift, has become a chain. And still, you rise each morning and plant. Because the field remembers. Because the children need to eat. Because the dream of abundance still glows behind your eyes, just dimmer now. But it's not over. Because even systems that rise from plenty can fall from within. And the hands that built granaries can still remember how to tear them down. Especially when they remember the difference between having more and having enough. You don't notice it at first, not in the day-to-day of grinding grain, of stoking fires, of drying skins by the hearth. But over time, you begin to see a pattern in the dirt, a shift in where the bodies lie. Your ancestors used to vanish into the wilderness, their bones scattered with the wind, hidden under trees, swept downriver, broken and buried by time. But now the bones remain. They linger, cluster. They don't return to the earth as they once did. They stay close, too close. You find them beneath your floor, in the corners of the fields, near the wells where water once felt like life. You mark them in shallow graves, in pits that were once storage and became something else when winter was hard and hands were few. This is the cost of stillness, of staying. Once death was distant, a guest who passed through when it pleased. Now it lives here, with you, in the walls and the soil and the air. Because you no longer die alone in the forest. You die together. You die in groups. And that changes everything. When bodies gather, they do something strange. They speak, not with words, but with patterns, with frequency, with proximity. And they begin to tell a story you didn't expect, that the life you built is heavier than you thought. You didn't plan for death to become domestic, but it is. And it brings companions. Disease, which once flared and vanished, now festers. It spreads hand to hand, mouth to mouth, breath to breath. The closer you live, the quicker it moves. The walls you built to protect the village now trap something else inside: contagion. It begins in fevers, coughs, a wasting look in the eyes. Then the children stop laughing. The elders stop singing. The air feels thick, not with smoke but with dread. And the healer's hands begin to tremble, not because she doesn't know what to do, but because she does, and knows it won't work. You gave up the chase for security, but now the security is brittle, fragile, and when it breaks for everyone. And yet you don't leave. Because the seed is here, the herd is here, the graves are here. And the living, too, are here, too many to scatter like the wind. So you endure. But death is no longer the only shadow in your village. The second comes slower, more deliberate, not sickness but struggle, not plague but power. Because now that land feeds people, people fight over land. You used to move away when things grew tense. When a hunting ground ran dry, you followed the herds. But the fields don't move. The wells don't follow the rains. And so, neither do you. And when someone claims what you believe is yours, you don't retreat. You defend. Conflict, once fleeting and scattered, now finds form. It wears faces. It chooses sides. And it doesn't always wait for provocation. Sometimes it grows in anticipation, in fear, in hunger, in memory. You don't just defend food, you defend pride, legacy, bloodlines. And so you fight. Sometimes with fists, sometimes with fire, sometimes with stone blades wet with the names of those you used to share meals with. And after the smoke clears, the bones are counted again. But they don't blow away. They stay. They remind. They rot into the very fields that once promised life. And those fields become something else. A kind of grave. Because when food is tied to territory, territory is tied to death. And yet you keep planting. Because you have to. Because there's no going back. This is the double-edged gift of permanence. You don't have to search anymore, but you also can't run. The roots you've grown are not just metaphor. They're real. They bind your stomach. They bind your feet. They bind your future to a piece of ground that is no longer just earth, it is history. And history, you're beginning to learn, does not forget. Your resilience is no longer in your ability to move, but in your ability to endure. To stay while others leave. To rebuild when the fever takes your kin. To replant where blood once soaked the rose. You tell yourself this is still progress. That calories are worth the cost. That stone walls beat cave mouths. That cemeteries mean continuity. But sometimes, in the quiet hour before dawn, you look at the village and wonder, what did we trade? We gave up the wind on our backs for smoke in our lungs. We gave up uncertainty for fragility. We gave up the wild for the walls. And though we gained warmth, we also lost something, something you can't quite name. Maybe it was freedom. Maybe it was forgetting. Maybe it was the sense that the world could be remade with each migration, not built once and inherited, with all its flaws. Now you inherit the consequences, the harvests and the plagues, the storage and the hoarding, the granary and the graveyard. They live side by side. And still, every morning the fire is stoked. The fields are checked. The children are fed. Because the promise of permanence is also a burden, but one you now carry together. You tell stories over the bones. You pass tools across the graves. And you sing lullabies louder than the silence. Because that too is human. You hold the paradox in your hands. That progress is not always peace. That settlement is not always safety. That permanence may come dressed as promise and still carry a cost. But you accept it. Because there's no single turning point. Only choices. And the long, slow unfolding of consequences. And tomorrow you'll plant again. And hope that this time the seeds will remember something better. You wake to the sound of footsteps, not birds. The dawn doesn't break over trees, it rises behind walls. Stone walls, plastered courtyards, roofs layered in mud brick, and behind every door people, more than you've ever known. 1,000 lives packed into a single rising breath. You are no longer just part of a village. You are part of something stranger and far larger. You are inside a city. It didn't arrive all at once. There was no grand unveiling, no horn announcing the future. It crept in, layer by layer, first a larger settlement, then a meeting ground, a seasonal market, then clay bricks where once there was thatch, then roads, real roads, straight, deliberate, carved through the belly of old footpaths. And finally, boundaries you can't walk across in a single day. You thought agriculture was the destination. It was. It was the beginning of gravity. Because surplus pulls people in. Like stars forming from dust, mass attracts mass. A few homes become many. A field becomes a district. A harvest becomes a tax. And suddenly, you're living inside an organism that breathes, remembers, and governs. You think the city was built by ambition, but really it was built by barley. It's not gold, not iron, but grain. Cities rise where water does, where rivers flood and retreat, where silt settles thick into the skin of the land, where each season's mud becomes next season's bread. Mesopotamia, the Indus, the Nile, the Yellow River, fertile crescents and flood-bent deltas, these weren't just lucky landscapes, they were wombs. Civilization didn't emerge in spite of the soil. It was summoned by it. You walk through the market and smell it everywhere: roasted emmer, leavened barley bread, lentils cooked in clay pots. You see it in sacks slung over shoulders, in baskets traded for copper pins. You touch it in the cuneiform marks etched into wet tablets, grain tallies, ration logs, labor assignments. Your food has become your math. And with math comes hierarchy. You used to measure time by seasons, shadows, the aching of joints before rain. Now you measure it in debts, in quotas, in how much grain you owe the temple after the flood. Because someone, somewhere, decided that your harvest must be counted, and that decision changed everything. You didn't notice it at first, the quiet rise of roles, the scribes, the tax collectors, the priest kings who claimed the gods lived in the ziggurat and required your wheat as worship. But now you can't not see it. The city lives on organization, on hierarchy, on management disguised as ritual. You who once bent to the wild rhythms of animal herds now bend to the calendar, the registry, the rule. Because in cities, food is no longer just sustenance. It's power. It's stored, measured, redistributed, controlled. You walk past the granary and feel its shadow stretch longer than the temple. And still you stay. Because the city offers things the forest never could. Specialists, bakers who don't farm, potters who don't hunt, children who learn to write before they learn to plant. Your life is no longer a solitary circle of survival. It is a web. You barter for obsidian blades from distant mountains. You eat sesame grown on the far side of the river. You wear cloth spun by someone you've never met. The city connects you, even as it confines you. And you, once a forager, now carry a name written in symbols, a job written in rations, and a home marked by a ledger. The field becomes law, the seed becomes coin, and memory becomes bureaucracy. You begin to forget what it felt like to sleep under stars. But even the city can't escape its roots. Every brick was baked by surplus, every wall laid by a hand fed by grain. Even the priest's incantations begin in cycles of planting and flood. And the city, for all its noise, still bows to the river. When the river swell, the city blooms. When the river fail, the city fractures. You've built walls to hold people, but you can't build walls high enough to hold weather. And so the city must plan, must record, must anticipate. The future becomes a problem to be solved, and the solving never stops. You tell stories now of ancient kings who could summon the rains, of scribes who could write the name of the moon and make the flood arrive on time. Myths rise like monuments to order, to structure, to the illusion of control. Because in the city, belief becomes cement. And belief must be managed. The temple, once a place of reverence, now issues grain. The gods, once whispered in the woods, now live in vaults. Even awe is centralized. And yet you believe. Because it's easier to believe in gods that promise harvests than to face a future that feels so brittle. You hold your child's hand as they walk into the schoolyard to learn the signs for barley, tax, and debt. You remember when knowledge was passed by gesture, by flame, by the turn of a root in your palm. Now it is carved in clay, permanent, standardized. And you wonder if something was lost in the standardizing. But the city doesn't slow down. It grows. It swells at the edges, spills over banks, births districts, marketplaces, courtrooms. Soon, there are people you'll never know living footsteps from your home. You pass strangers every day and don't speak. The intimacy of the village fades into the hum of the collective. You feel both safer and lonelier. You eat bread every day. You haven't hunted in years. Your feet are softer. Your back stooped from different labor. And yet, when you look up at the grain store carved like a temple, when you stand beneath archways taller than any tree you've ever seen, you feel awe. Not wild awe, but human awe. You are standing inside a monument built from agriculture, from repetition, from thousands of hands, thousands of seasons, laying one brick at a time, from barley fields that gave birth to bureaucracy, to art, to order. The city is not natural, but it is human. And so are you. The one who shaped the earth, who bent wild seeds to your will, who turned chaos into cultivation. You called it domestication. You thought you were in control. But you were. Because the plants remember. They remember longer than stone, longer than story, longer than you. Wheat, rice, maize, they do not forget. You gave them your labor, your land, your rituals, and in return they gave you civilization. But they didn't stop there. They grew beyond you. They crossed borders you never imagined, sailed oceans you never touched, slipped into ships, into sacks, into the seams of empire. They passed from continent to continent in conquest, in trade, in hunger. They moved through your history like blood through a vein. And wherever they went, they changed everything. Rice softened landscapes, bent rivers into terraces. Maize turned arid plains into kingdoms. Wheat built cities so vast you forgot they were rooted in grass. These weren't just crops, they were compasses. Carving roots of empire, roots of war, you marched for them. You killed for them. You enslaved and were enslaved in their name. Because food was never just food. It was politics, power, memory. A single grain of wheat carries more human history than most libraries. Each kernel is a fossil of desire, of the hands that planted it, of the systems that demanded it, of the mouths it promised to fill. And those grains are still growing, long after the hands are gone. You thought the story ended with you, that once your harvest was done, the cycle stopped. But the plants went on. They were never really yours. They were passengers, survivors, collaborators. You gave them fields, they gave you fate. And they outlasted you. They grew in abandoned temples, in ditches near forgotten cities, in cracks of concrete, in refugee gardens planted by those with nothing left but seed and memory. They grew in slave plantations, where stolen hands planted stolen crops in stolen soil. They grew in suitcases carried across oceans, smuggled between pages of prayer books, sewn into hymns. Because when everything else is taken, the seed remains. The seed is hope you can hold. And still they grow. You walk through a supermarket and see the proof. Shelves of cereal descended from ancient grasses, corn syrup in every bottle, soy in every loaf, rice on every plate. The plants have spread further than any empire ever did. And they did it through you. Because in every generation you chose them, chose what to sow, what to carry, what to save. You taught your children the feel of good seed between their fingers. You blessed the first sprout. You wept in drought, rejoiced in rain, knelt in harvest. You knelt. That was always the truth. For all your tools, your fences, your knowledge, you served them as much as they served you. And they remember. They remember the fields where your ancestors first carved furrows with bone and hope. They remember the floods you tried to predict, the pests you tried to fight, the prayers you whispered when the sky went quiet. They remember your mistakes, your hungers, your revolutions. Because agriculture was never static, it adapted, twisted, rewired itself to meet your shifting needs. When you built kingdoms, it gave you surplus. When kingdoms fell, it grew wild again. When your body broke under its labor, it still rose in the morning sun. It is patient. You dig a hole and find an old seed, einkorn wheat, preserved by accident or by reverence. You hold it in your palm and feel time bend. This seed fed someone who died 1,000 years before your language was born. And still, with water and warmth, it will grow. Nothing else you've made lasts like this. Not your laws, not your monuments, not your stories etched in stone. Even your gods fade, but the plants remember. They are the archive beneath your feet. You walk a ruined road, stones cracked by centuries of frost and war. But beside it, wild barley waves in the wind, the descendant of fields long lost. It grew back without permission, without a map, without memory. And yet it remembers. The shape of your hand, the sound of the sickle, the shadow of your breath. You see it now, the myth unraveling. You never truly tamed the wild. You became part of it. You and the plants forged a pact, not of dominance but of entanglement. Your roots braided into theirs, your futures interlocked. You made them depend on you, but you depended even more on them. And when you vanish, when your cities crumble, your gods fall silent, your names are forgotten, they will go on growing. They will wait for the next hand, the next hunger, the next human. You stand in a modern field. But this is no longer a place of sticks and seed sacks. This is precision. This is data. Steel teeth churn the soil where once bare hands did. Machines hum in sync with satellite constellations. You scan the earth not with your eyes but with algorithms. You no longer listen for the season, you model it, forecast it, simulate it. And yet beneath all that, dirt, the same ancient dirt. It clings to your boots just as it clung to the feet of the first woman who bent to sow barley. The chemical codes may have changed. The crops may be patented. The field may now be leased through 4 layers of abstraction, but the ground remembers. And the question rises like heat from that soil. Are you still cultivating the future? Or is it cultivating you? Because this story didn't end with the plow, it only deepened. 12,000 years ago, the glaciers retreated, but something far more irreversible began. A transformation not of climate, but of consciousness. You didn't just learn to plant. You learned to predict, to delay, to design the future. And once that door opened, you never stopped walking through it. Each generation added a new layer: irrigation, domestication, fermentation, bureaucracy, belief, boundaries, surplus, cities, industry. You climbed a ladder built from grain and fire and fossil fuel, until the field became the factory, until food became a formula. And still the seed persists. Now it lives in cryogenic vaults, guarded like treasure. It's encoded, encrypted, insured against collapse. You've frozen it in time just in case. Because some part of you knows, for all your progress, you've wandered far from the garden. And maybe you can't go back. Maybe you wouldn't want to, but you still kneel. Not in reverence, perhaps, but in calibration. You kneel to test nitrogen levels, to check for glyphosate resistance, to recalibrate the drone swarm that scans chlorophyll from the air. You kneel to the future. A future you engineered, or thought you did. Because now your tools are starting to think for themselves. You splice genomes not by trial and error, but by code. You edit life the way your ancestors carved seeds into tombs. Back then it was prayer. Now it's precision. And still it is faith. Faith that this new harvest will feed more than mouths, that it will feed futures. But the more control you gain, the more the question sharpens. What did you plant in yourself? What grew inside you while you domesticated the world? Your ancestors once knelt in fields, bare feet pressing into wet soil, dreaming of safety, of full bellies, of warmth in winter. Their needs were simple. Their world was brutal. The seed was salvation. But now you stand in a global system of monoculture, genetic bottlenecks, disappearing pollinators, soil depletion, rising seas. The field stretches across continents but becomes more fragile with every yield. Abundance has a cost. Efficiency has a shadow. And maybe the most dangerous thing you ever planted wasn't wheat or rice or maize. Maybe it was certainty. Certainty that growth is always good, that more is always better, that the next innovation will solve the last disaster. But seeds don't just sprout food. They sprout values, habits, assumptions, and those grow roots deeper than any crop. You taught yourself to wait, to plan, to accumulate, to defend what you planted. You learned to measure success in quantity, not resilience, in permanence, not adaptability. The seed changed your hunger not just for food, but for the future itself. And now, in this modern field, you must ask, how do you live with what you've grown? Because you are no longer the forager, no longer the farmer even. You are the inheritor of 10,000 decisions made in seasons you can't remember. You reap what was sown long before you knew what was being planted. And the harvest isn't just grain, it's civilization. It's the Anthropocene. It's the weight of a species trying to manage the very biosphere it evolved from. But maybe, just maybe, you're ready to remember. Not to rewind, not to return to caves or fire pits, but to remember how all of this began, a human kneeling, holding a seed, feeling the tension of potential, that quiet moment before the future roots itself into the soil. You still have that moment, because planting is always a beginning. And though the world may seem locked in the architecture of what you've already built, cities, economies, climate systems, the seed still offers an exit, or an entrance, a different logic. One of patience, of reciprocity, of listening to the dirt. You stand in a modern field, but beneath you is an ancient memory. And somewhere inside you, something else begins to stir, not nostalgia but clarity. You realize the seed is not a tool. It's a mirror. And the future it reflects depends entirely on how and why you plant it.